Welcome to our first screencast video lecture. The goal here is to give you a very brief introduction to reading cases. We'll start here with the basics of reading judicial opinions. I'm afraid the former paralegals among you will have to bear with us. These are pretty nuts and bolts ideas, but they're useful. We should all be on the same page. So here are the terms this lecture will introduce. Let's look back at the Bailey opinion. So here's the first part of the Bailey opinion. Let's ask ourselves what the caption tells us about the case. And you should know that this is an abbreviated version of the caption that appears in the official reporter. We'll talk about that in a moment. So first of all, we see who are the parties? Bailey versus West. Turns out in the official reporter that we also learn it's Howard E. Bailey versus Richard E. West. That might be useful information if you need to know the gender of the parties. You can get it from the full name that's listed in the official reporter. Casebooks in general use an abbreviated form of the case title, and this is the title that I will be using. Second, we learn what court, the jurisdiction in which the case has been decided. The Supreme Court of Rhode Island in this case. Third, we learn where to find this opinion. So these numbers look a little incomprehensible, but they're actually pretty straightforward. So the first number before the initials is the volume of a reporter. Those are reporters that collect cases. And then the second number after the initials is the page number, the initial page number. So the first one, RI, is Rhode Island Reporter. That's the official Rhode Island reports, would collect the Supreme Court opinions of the state of Rhode Island. And then the second one, A second, is Atlantic Second. That would be a reporter produced by a private company known as West, and all of the cases from the Atlantic region are collected in the Atlantic Reporter, and this is the second series of that reporter, volume 249, page 414. The next thing you learn from this abbreviated caption is the date when the case was decided. Notice here it's abbreviated to be just the year. In the official reporter you would find the date was January 22nd of 1969. That might be valuable information if you need to know whether this case was decided before or after another case. The fact that it was decided in January would explain, for example, why this case did not cite a case that was decided subsequently, say in June or July. The next thing you see here is which judge wrote the opinion. So Judge Paulino, he's the justice on the Rhode Island Supreme Court. Again, in the official reporter, we would get a little more information. There were other judges involved in this panel, and so Chief Justice Roberts, Justice Powers, Justice Jocelyn, and Justice Kelleher were also involved in this decision. So this is a lot of information in 4 lines, and that's important for you to be able to pull that information out so you can find a case, know what case you're looking at, and know where it was decided. Let's look at the first line of the court's opinion. What is a civil action? I'll give you a hint. The answer here, at least, doesn't involve John Travolta. It's any non-criminal lawsuit. Criminal actions are those that are instituted by the state for violations of penal codes. So there's a state penal code, the federal drug laws, perjury statutes, for example. And only crimes are punishable by imprisonment. There are some crimes that carry just fines, and it's also true that civil penalties can be quite large. But in general, civil claims we view as being somewhat less serious than those involving criminal conduct. All contract claims are civil actions, so we will be discussing in this course only civil actions, civil matters. Let's figure out first who's involved in this case. So we saw from the caption that Bailey and West are the parties to the litigation. So let's ask ourselves who they are. So first of all, Bailey is the owner of a farm that boards horses. He is the plaintiff. You might ask yourself how you get to be a plaintiff. Is it just something that you get designated? But no, actually, you begin a lawsuit by filing a complaint. And the complaint names the initial parties to a suit. So a plaintiff files a complaint and it names the other parties, and typically what would be involved is naming defendants. So in this case, Bailey sued West. West is the purchaser of a racehorse that Bailey cared for at his farm, and West is called the defendant. That means he was named by the plaintiff in the complaint as the defendant. You can have multiple defendants. In this case, there's simply one defendant, West. Other than the parties, who else is involved in this case? Well, there's defendant's trainer, that's the way the court refers to it. That's West's trainer. He's a horse trainer who works for West. Dr. Strauss is a person who sold the horse to West. Originally, the horse was sold to West by Dr. Strauss. Tom Kelly is the van driver, and the briefs explain, although it's not mentioned in the court's opinion, that Strauss also has a trainer, and his name was Lawrence Geiger. So who else is involved in this case? So one really important character is, of course, Bascom's Folly, the horse. Now for class, writing out a detailed chronology of this case. That's an extremely important skill for organizing facts in litigation settings, and it's quite valuable to start practicing now. So I encourage you to do a very good job of working out carefully the chronological order of all the events in the case, and we'll talk in a minute about some other elements that you should include in that chronology. So in addition to the factual story of what led to the litigation, I think that's an obvious part of the chronology, let me give you some guidance about the other elements you'll be including in your chronology. Now we start with the litigation. So we need to know the procedural history of the case. You also sometimes will hear a reference to the procedural posture of a case. That means where we are now in the procedure that's taken place. The procedural history is a little more comprehensive and involves everything that's happened up until now. The procedural history asks what legal proceedings have already taken place. So how did it begin? How did the litigation begin? What were the lower court actions? What did the trial court decide? Were there an intermediate appellate court? And do we now have an appeal in a higher court, say the Supreme Court? It will also be useful when we're looking at an opinion like Bailey against West to think about what legal questions the appellate court thinks it needs to resolve. This information frames the issues the court is going to decide. The way that the court resolves these questions is called its ruling or holding. Your chronology should include the bare essence of the court's ruling. You shouldn't worry, at the moment at least, about the court's reasoning, and you'll analyze that closely in class. So you might think we are done. The court has ruled, and the case is over. But that's not all. The final act in litigation is the judgment, sometimes called the final judgment, and an order. This is partly housekeeping on the part of the court clerk. There's a final entry on the docket that ends the litigation. But the court issues an order, and that actually turns out to be extremely important. So this isn't simply housekeeping. The reason is that a judgment can be enforced, whereas a ruling cannot. So the holding might sound favorable, but the judgment is what you take to the sheriff. Usually the parties supply a draft order. You should always be sure to include what your client wants from litigation in the order that you draft. Of course, these are just the basics of reading a case. You'll focus in class on finding applicable legal rules, determining which facts are relevant, and understanding the court's reasoning. Thanks for listening.